postmodern big theory years, right? Sort of undermining these claims to truth or something like it. But I think I'm completely trying to highlight things that are already there. And certainly in terms of something like, you know, kind of a documentary poetics, the sort of thing that Andrews or Goldsmith is doing, these things have a long, rich history. And you know, what is the Wasteland but kind of a documentary poem in its own way, right? It's a pastiche. So it's not that someone has invented this kind of thing, but it's more a matter of intensifying attention to certain kinds of practices and movements, which may, in a situation, get us somewhere else. So it's a recycling operation, it seems to me. I'm not trying to invent anything new, but there are other sort of formations, other ways of looking at things that, not because they're wrong or they're right, but we haven't been trying them so much because our focus has been over here, something like meaning. So yeah, I'm absolutely trying to.
I guess I'm thinking of Kenneth Burke.
Yeah.
And your whole project seems to be in part, an homage, to some extent. And he's a theorist who's kind of forgotten. And so I was hoping to hear a little bit more about, what you owe.
Right. I mean, I think Burke is a key figure here because this is, it's his phrase from 1939, right? Somewhere around there, literature as equipment for living. And for Burke, I mean, Burke's target, I think, is a slightly different target than mine. His target is something like genre theory, or like knowing the difference between a poem and a story. But he calls it philosophy of the bin. Like, where do I put this? Is this a poem? Is this a play? Is this? And he's saying, well, that's not really the right question, right? Once you know that it's a poem, then what do you know? But the question for literature is, what does it allow you to do? How does it help you to get from here to there in some ways? And he's pretty much alone in the modernist period asking these kinds of questions, right? So yeah, I'm very much trying to reinvigorate that sense, and I take Deleuze to be a pragmatist par excellence, right? You're just looking for tools and trying to get from here to there. And it's certainly not a trans-historical kind of argument. It's not like everyone should be doing. I'm not trying to say that you should give up on meaning and everybody should be. Like, and this is Malibu's thing, plasticity, right? I'm not looking for a new phrase or a new master term, because I think part of what the big theory years showed us is that, the master terms may be over, right? It may not, that everyone's going to be doing new historicism, or everyone's going to be doing deconstruction, or everyone's going to be doing this. That, the English department at this point is a mongrel hybrid of all kinds of cool stuff. And I think that's great, right? Literature does different things for post-colonial critics than it does for people who work on linguistics, which is different for people who work on video or film, and it seems to me that's great, but that's part of this kind of, we're no longer in this philosophy of the bin trying to say literature is this and only this, that it can do myriad different things.
Yeah. I came late, so I didn't hear all of what you said, but what I did hear I really appreciated. I wanted to sort of pick up on the question about Burke, because I was, one of the things I was struck with, I really enjoyed your talk, is a question about what Burke would call scene, or the location part of it, because I was much struck by the move towards globalization and flow as the new approach for locating the work that we do. And if I understand the poem you were having us read, I'm not sure because I can only hear it, that sort of plethora of images that come from a whole different kind of creating something new with that, which involves the kind of location that might occur globally and through the internet as being where we locate our work. And I kind of wanted you just to speak to that, because there are a number of us here that work from a perspective that tries to reinvigorate the local, the really specific scene, as maybe an alternative to a new totalitarianism of the globalization metaphor. And I don't know, that's sort of a question to throw out to see where you want to run with it.
No, I mean, it's a good question. I think one of the things that, if you're interested in something like avant-garde poetry, one of the things that's interesting about it is where it's gone to live is the web, right? If you look at UbuWeb or PenSound and Marco and I were talking about this, if you're a certain kind of student of the avant-garde, you can now go on the web and you can see these things which otherwise were completely, Vito Acconci performances from the 70s and things like this. I mean, things that were just impossible really to access unless you had a library, or you could go to the Art Institute in Chicago, they had the video data bank there. But these things were impossible to get a hold of, and now they're right at your fingertips. And I think one could argue that that sort of ruins a certain local production model. At the same time, these things are, I think, invigorating to people at all in little niches and corners of the world. I mean, Goldsmith runs this thing, and he says, I get emails from people all over the world who say, "Wow, I'm the only person in my field who thinks this way, and it was great for me to see this sort of thing, and I have this whole archive of people I'm connected to." And you don't need traditional publication mechanisms. You don't need all these other kinds of things. So I mean, I would tend to think of it less a matter of that globalization just sort of smashes over the local. But certainly one of the things, globalization itself tends to celebrate the local, like the niche, the small thing. But I think economic globalization, you know, one can always argue about whether, you know, it's a double-edged sword, and certainly, you know, Jameson always says, you know, it's the best thing that ever happened, and it's also the worst thing that ever happened. But I tend to think of it more as a matter of it's happened. So the question is, how does one respond to it? And I think it may be more of a cost-benefit analysis. It seems to me it's made a whole lot of things possible that weren't possible before, and it may have made some other things not so possible. But I don't think it's made it impossible to have sort of local. I mean, I live in a small town in Pennsylvania, much smaller than Lincoln, and there's plenty of people living off the grid, organic farms, but these people are all hooked up by the internet, right? They learn to do what they're doing. So the local knowledge is passed around very much more quickly and more efficiently. So, I mean, is that a new local? Is it the same local? I don't know, but I think it's a different problem, and it's not. I don't think it's changed by globalization. It's not made better or worse, or some things I suspect are made impossible. But I certainly don't think localism is made impossible by it. Nealon.
How should we think of writers now like Goldsmith or Andrews? Barth says authors dead, they should be, they're scripters now. Here with this, which might belong to the linguistic turn as you speak of it. So I'm wondering with this political turn, how would you think we should think of writers now? You mentioned documentarian earlier, you mentioned recycler. I'm just sort of curious.
Well, no, I mean, it's a good question. It does seem a little bit odd when you look at what Goldsmith is doing. I mean, there are two things that immediately pop to mind. Like, one is, this is brilliantly new, but that's not what he says it is. Right? At some level, it's sort of brilliant in its own way. But the other thing is, it is odd that it's taken, Death of the Author is, what, 1967? And that made its way into sort of critical discourse very, very quickly, and people have been more or less, this analysis seems like it's correct, but it hasn't really seemed to have any real material effects on writing practice very much. In fact, it seems to have ushered in an era, at least in theoretical discourse, of the master geniuses, right? The Foucaults, the Deleuze's, the Derridas. So it seemed like it was quite the opposite of what it pronounced. But, I mean, maybe what it pronounced is that the geniuses will be people who can put things together in a particular kind of way, right? I mean, that what innovation is putting things together in a particular kind of way, rather than creating entirely new. That the new is the new is a juxtapositive, if that's a word, phenomena, rather than one that's just created by the will of a genius of some kind. And maybe that's the distinction between modernism and postmodernism that gets intensified in post-postmodernism. Is, you know, the idea that there is this brand spanking new version of the avant-garde seems harder and harder to imagine, right? Some 50, 60 years after high modernism. So I think it's more a matter of describing what you do, perhaps in a more reality-based way. Right? That really what you're doing is rearranging things to some degree. And I think, you know, there are versions of this. I mean, Goldsmith is interesting. He says, look, you don't even have to read these things. It's the idea that's interesting. And he's trying to intensify a certain tradition in American poetry, which wants to drive people out of consideration of the poem to consideration of something else. Right, to consideration of discourses that surround it, to political, social, or other kinds of phenomena. And this has for a long time been the dream of a certain kind of poetry to have an effect in the world. And I think part of what he's doing by evacuating the poem of any inherent interest is it just displaces the discussions that one might have about it, you know, back onto the people who are reading it. So I think, well, at one level it seems like a navel-gazing kind of operation of the avant-garde. At another level, it's an attempt to try to intensify the desire for political engagement that poetry has. And the better the poem is, the less, ironically, the less it sort of forces you to think about something other than the poem, right? Well, the ironic, Wallace Stevens' poem, the very rottenness of it makes it hard to get out of, right? Whereas even someone like Baraka has for years been sort of performing poetry in a certain kind of way, which is an attempt to provoke things. And I take it to be an intensification of that rather than, you know, making. I I think making it new is now rearranging something that's old.
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned a couple of narrative writers in passing, somewhat jokingly. You talked about Brian Evanson being a better writer than some others.
Yeah.
How do you see? You talked a bit about poetry, and you talked about Goldsmith's kind of not exactly narrative work, but do you see possibilities for a postmodern kind of narrative form? Is that anything that you think about, or is that?
Well, certainly that whole kind of reality manifesto
Yeah.
business, David Shields and people like him. I mean, that in the narrative world, it seems like it has a certain level of saturation.
Yeah.
Right? People like Latham have more or less sort of have glommed onto this. So again, I think it's less a matter of these are very intense versions of this kind of thing. They're stripped down to nothing but provocation, and that's why they become more useful examples. It may be interesting to try to think about this in terms of fiction, in terms of that kind of reality manifesto stuff, the return to a certain kind of realism, but a realism that's been through this incredible pulverizing postmodernism, right? It's not a going back to realism, it's a reinvented version of realism that has, and you can see it in visual art, sort of Cindy Sherman style, these very posed versions of narrative. And it seems like those are the sort of people who are doing, I mean, why someone like Evanson seems interesting to me, rather than someone like Vollmann, who's very, I think, an interesting writer to some degree, but it's very much this kind of heroic quest kind of operation, which again produces all kinds of interesting results. But it seems like it's not quite nested enough in a certain understanding of what that thing might mean. And again, I mean, the list there, I think I was just trying to sort of more or less make fun of my own investment in this thing. Because it's kind of bar chat to some degree, we're the good ones, we're the bad ones, why not get you like that? Springsteen is obviously putrid for American music, but but that's, at the end of the day, that's to fuck you the bin. We're not doing that, right? That's not theoretical work. So it's not that there are writers who are more deterritorializing than others, but that writing itself is based on how one looks or what one is looking for, what one is tracing through when one reads becomes a different kind of operation, it seems to me.
Okay, so something like David Shields' Reality Hunger, it becomes less about the narrative itself, but the discussions that circulate. I mean, there's
right.
created quite a bit of controversy.
Well, right, but I mean, I think that's again, the kind of the privilege of reality in that book is it's an already deconstructed version of reality, right? So reality actually is this pastiche of text, which is an interesting, and it's trying to reinvent the manifesto. I mean, so there's this way in which it's repeating all sorts of very familiar gestures, but it does. The demonstration itself shows you that you can produce something new, right? And I think, again, in fiction, it seems like that's the most intense moment I can think of where that's going on. And what its consequences would be, I'm not entirely sure. But certainly, I mean, postmodernism is also a word that has, it's an ugly word, and I don't particularly like it. But there certainly are people who, it seems clear to people who, at least my friends who work primarily on fiction, that the kind of postmodern era in fiction is over. That whatever it is that, whatever it is that the sort of McSweeney's people are doing is informed by postmodernism, but is not, Dave Eggers is not Pynchon or something like that. And that strikes me as being true. I mean, I'm not, it's more of an affect for me than anything else. I mean, obviously the longer sentences, and that sense of corrosive interruption that you get from Pynchon